Let me turn now to the issue of actual policies. So I want to open this up to the panelists and ask, what policies by the governments we all represent here could or would be effective in addressing religious freedom or religious restrictions, and which are least effective or which are not working? So either one.
Yeah, maybe I can.
Go ahead.
Because I think we are already exactly talking about what to do when talking what not to do. And I also particularly liked what Pasquale said when pointing to the need of coherence, because coherence is the matter of credibility, which is exactly also what Andrew just mentioned, especially when now Western governments engage. Okay, yes, and then self-critical analysis of the homework we should do, we have partially done, maybe not entirely done, is a very important part of that, in order to not face the accusation of being just clientelistic. So it's really important then to address the issues here. So credibility, coherence, broad alliances, and that maybe is another a keyword for me, broad alliances. Let me just give you two examples. CSW, I know there are some people from CSW here, yeah?
Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Christian Solidarity Worldwide, thank you very much. They, some years ago, 2 years ago, also worked on the case of an atheist blogger in Indonesia, Alexander An. If I'm correctly informed, you also visited him in prison, which is perfect, and really has also led to new alliances, especially in the UK, between the humanist organizations and CSW, which is really important. Another example for me, one of the most impressive examples, last year, the representatives of the Baha'is in Geneva spoke about the rise of persecution of Shia Muslims. I mean, just consider that for a moment. The Baha'is suffering terribly persecution in Iran under the auspices of a Shia regime, which of course not all the Shia Ayatollahs like. I mean, there are lots of Ayatollahs also, so high-ranking Shia clerics opposing that. But nonetheless, under the auspices of Shiism, they suffered terribly. And now the Baha'i representative in Geneva is as broad-minded, as broad-hearted to really talk about the rise of Shia persecution. Wonderful, wonderful. And I think this is what I like to see more. I mean, universalism is not something abstract. I mean, we have to name people. We have to address specific phenomena, but always broad, and see there can be even others coming into that alliance. And let me say one maybe also critical word now on, we are here in the Catholic Church, or in the Pontifical University. And the Catholic Church does a lot based on Dignitatis Humanae, which is a wonderful document. Where I see the Catholic Church partially missing is at the NGO level. That is a level of diplomacy that I would say the Catholic Church has not fully explored yet. So when I have my regular meetings in Geneva, in New York, and elsewhere with NGOs supporting freedom of religion or belief, Catholic organizations are sadly underrepresented in comparison with evangelicals, for instance, with Baha'is. And meanwhile, the humanists might even outnumber the Catholics. So, I mean, I would here call for a healthy competition. Being here at a Catholic place, I think the Catholic Church does a lot. But at that level, really, I would like to see much more.
All right, let's hear from some of the rest of you. Policies. What works, what doesn't? Oh, Pasquale, yes.
Just to elaborate briefly on this important point that was raised by Hannah on the bureaucratic mentality. Well, this is true, but it's also true that diplomacy is undergoing a deep transformation in the last decades. Basically, the way in which a diplomat was trained was to see the world through the lens of real power, realist categories like trade, non-proliferation, and all these kind of things related to hard power, let's say. Whereas today the main issue is basically material, has to do with identity, with dignity, with elements that are not included in the traditional training of a diplomat. And if any introduction to religion is present in the program, is through the issue of cultural diplomacy. This has nothing to do with cultural diplomacy. We are talking about something structural, not cultural. So religions are embedded in the development of any society, and it is a structural factor, not just a cultural factor. And this also implies some consequences for policies, because it's true that there is the bureaucratic mentality, but there is also a governmental Westphalian mentality. I know many diplomats that send report denouncing a very critical situation, and then for consideration of real politic, this consideration does not translate necessarily into policy. So I advocate for close cooperation between diplomats, between government officials and politicians, and also academia, because they bring also a different perspective. It's such a huge endeavor that we need to bring together all the different possibility to overcome this issue.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, Marianne.
I'd like to add a note about coalitions among countries, because now that I've had 3 years of service on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom and encountered many frustrations along the way, it seems to me that probably when I look back on those years, I will think the most important thing that we did was to join in and foster coalitions with other countries and meetings among parliamentary groups that have grown. When we started 3 years ago, I think there were 5 or 6 countries involved. Now we're up to 50, over 50. And the importance of that, especially for us in the United States, is when we speak alone, when any country speaks alone in defense of religious freedom, one is suspected of having geopolitical concerns that are not really germane to the religious freedom issue. The more you get a group of countries, all of which are committed to the principles in the Universal Declaration, which, as Heiner reminds us, are interdependent and indivisible. You can't break off religious freedom. The more you get a unified voice, the more effective we're going to be.
Andrew.
I just want to second what Marianne has said, and I talked about innovation in my opening sort of salvo, and I think innovation in foreign policy is very important, given what Pasquale just said about the evolution of diplomatic engagement on a whole range of issues that weren't top of mind 25 years ago. When we sort of established the office in Canada, it was established by the previous government 3 years ago almost now, we could count on probably about 4 or 5 countries, like-minded countries with whom we had a very deep engagement on advancement of religious freedom. The United States, obviously, with a common approach in terms of having an office and an ambassador. The UK, Norway, Germany, the Dutch, and then we sort of had a lot of work with the EU. We realized fairly early on that if we wanted to amplify our efforts collectively, we needed to grow that group. And we're very much committed to the formal sort of multilateralism through the UN, through the Human Rights Council, through various resolutions that are presented there each year, through the Third Committee of the General Assembly that deals with human rights. But there is a real, and Heiner actually mentioned this at a meeting that we organized as Canada in New York about a year and a half ago now. There was a void between foreign ministries acting on this. And so with our American allies and other like-minded countries, we brought together a group that had its inaugural meeting in June of this year at the Canadian Mission in Brussels. And we brought together 24 countries to establish an international contact group on religious freedom. And the contact group does not speak as the contact group, but it provides a forum whereby countries can engage when issues arise in the world and we need to respond in some way, through engaging governments and calling them to account for their action or inaction, engaging on the ground for those countries such as Canada and the US, the Brits, that have the capacity to engage in programmatic support through different projects on the ground. And what was interesting about this group were two things. First of all, we expanded it well beyond kind of the traditional Western liberal democracies to include countries such as Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, Cameroon, Senegal, Chile, Colombia. And what we found is when those countries came together in this forum, they said, we're outside of our typical blocks that we have in the UN, where we have to sort of keep in line with how our bloc votes, how our bloc speaks. And here we have this opportunity to speak about this issue in a way that we can engage and share approaches so as to try and do good in the world. So that's an effort that buttresses the International Panel of Parliamentarians. And there are a lot of these different types of innovative approaches that are emerging from a variety of different areas, including in the European Union.
David, before I turn to you, I just want to kind of set the context that the United States has the longest standing Office of International Religious Freedom since 1999. You've been heavily involved throughout that process, either inside or outside of the formal structures. And so what works, what doesn't, and why haven't we been more successful? The situation isn't very good right now, globally. So what do you think? What have you learned?
All right, so let's again go through just a group of these. I think the structure that the United States government chose in several regards was a very good thing and has added significantly. First, having an independent commission that Marianne sits on now, to be an outside check, not under the government's control, to give candid evaluation and assessment to the State Department and the White House, has really, everything that they write gets read by the decision makers, and it has direct or indirect influence on it. Secondly, the report that we put out, the decision to put out an annual report, I think has lifted up this issue. It is provided, we hear from a number of other foreign ministries, we could never do this report. We send it out to our people in our embassies across the globe and say this is your blueprint for how to deal with this. The work that we have done with sanctions, mixed bag. I'd love to hear others on this. A mixed bag. Sanctions tend to work, if you look back in general, sanctions tend to work where you're dealing with a society that is proto-democratic entities that are able to be an echo chamber and use it as a tool. So, think of South Africa. It had a relatively free press and labor unions and entities that could use it there. The more repressive societies, but I will tell you, it has gotten a number of countries to the table in where we're working on changing policies which otherwise wouldn't happen here, but we use it and people get used to it, and then its influence dissipates. Our efforts on prisoners of conscience that we've worked with many of you in organizational life and in your governments to help some of the prisoners of conscience who we have gotten out. This is something that I take a great deal of pride in of what we've achieved, to be in the courtroom in Khartoum as the two pastors who were the leading prisoners of conscience after Miriam Ibrahim that many of us worked together on to encourage her release, and to hear the court dismissed all of the trumped-up charges, convicted of 2 misdemeanors to time served, but hear them with their lawyers turn around and said, this was because of the international community. That's something extraordinary. We have a list of prisoners of conscience that we're focused on now. I hope I'll have a chance to talk about it, but we have to continue to work together on that. The training programs we do. We're doing training programs for our foreign service officers so that they know how religion fits into their work. I think we would like to see it be compulsory here, but it is a robust program that more and more people volunteer for. And we're doing training programs now with embassies all across the globe, actually not just long distance, but flying out to regions and bringing people together about how to do the reports and how to do the investigations and how to connect with the right entities. This is having a very positive kind of impact. This isn't well known, and I can't go into details. Almost everything about the United States government has to be transparent. What I'm about to say now is actually an explicit exception to that, and that is our enormous programmatic activity in the human rights field. And the reason that it is not transparent is that the well-being, the safety, the lives of some of the people we're helping would be in danger if people knew that we were supporting this. But, you know, the broad training we give to lawyers across the globe about how to litigate cases on behalf of religious freedom, what we would do with the NGO communities to help build a broad, you know, these are long-distance investments we're making. It's not going to change things overnight. Venezuela didn't change its government overnight here, but, you know, there was a lot of international support for building civil societies that when a government changes, that those who want to take advantage to strengthen rule of law and democratic norms are going to be able to do it. And obviously those countries that do have free elections, whatever their government might be, always gives an opportunity for countries to be able to change for the better. You know, these are long-term investments on all of that. If I had to talk about three things that I think would make a difference that we haven't done a good job on, I'm very proud of Andrew's leadership and the contact group on the executive branches and the Commission's work in stimulating a parliamentarian group. It's not a resource we've really used adequately yet. We really have to mobilize far more effectively than we've done. We need to use better regional groupings or interest groupings. Here, nothing would be more important than, and we're in discussions about this, for the OIC and some of us here to work together to do training about tolerance and, you know, the implementation of UN Resolution 1618 here. So we need to be better with the regional groups and the other interest groups across the globe. And I'll just say one other thing that I have to say. I was appalled, Heiner, that you didn't mention, which is, it's about time the UN put staff and resources and salaries behind the special rapporteur for here. So.
Well, we'll give you staff then anyway. All right. Well,
I have one person,
yes.
one person at the Office of the High Commissioner, but
Okay.
it's not my staff. Yeah.
well, let's. We really pledged to open this up for questions. So if you have questions, please come down to the microphones. Yes, we'd be delighted to have your questions.
Thank you. I've had the honor of dealing with four of your panelists. It's, the UK is really a good bypass for lots of activity. And I wish we had our own UK religious ambassador. It's something that we've been pushing with the UK government for quite a while. We're still going to try pushing, even if it doesn't come about. Our problem, I think, with Christians in the Middle East is that Christianity is seen to be Western, and so it presents a problem. In the West, people see themselves either as Christian nations or as secular nations. If they see themselves as Christian, then they don't want to defend Christians, so they're not seen as being biased. And if they're secular, they don't want to present Christians, so they're not seen to be biased. So no matter how they see themselves, it presents a problem. The other thing, so I'm wondering what the solution to that is. The other thing is, I have spoken to people in the UK who have worked on the collaborative effort at the political level, and I've suggested that there is almost a disconnect between the political activity and the religious activity of leadership. And I've suggested that there should be a reference group in support of the political representatives made up of sympathetic and strong and outspoken religious leaders across the board, so that there's a collaboration at those two levels. So I was wondering if there are comments on that as well.
With respect to the questions, I'll just let any of the panelists who'd like to answer take on those questions. So, excellent questions. Yes, Andrew.
Maybe just to address your point, Your Grace, about your last point about an advocacy group made up of religious leaders, prominent religious leaders. I think that's a very important element. And again, especially coming from countries such as the UK, the US, Canada, and other countries here in Europe, other countries that are represented in this contact group that we have, a lot of the work that I do is outreach. Even though I have no domestic mandate in Canada, I'm focused on international religious freedom. I do a lot of domestic outreach to communities that are concerned about what's happening overseas and want to contribute to that Canadian voice speaking on these issues. And the ability that such a group could have, not only in terms of advocacy on behalf of the work that's being done by parliamentarians, by governments, but the work that such a group could perform in terms of informing on an ongoing, more formalized basis the work that we do. Again, using that kind of term, like the nuanced information, or what we sometimes call in Canada sticky knowledge, that religious communities can provide, that allow us as foreign policy professionals and foreign policy makers in terms of our ministerial level, that nuanced kind of sticky knowledge about how to address certain circumstances that are underway in the world and that we need to be concerned with, that is essential. That knowledge is really essential. We rely very heavily, obviously, on our missions abroad that are witnessing what's happening in certain countries, and they're sending us reports. We work closely with NGOs, but we have not fully tapped in to religious communities and faith communities, and even the non-religious sort of secular humanist communities that are seeing what's happening in different parts of the world, and they have a focus and their own networks that can be tremendously effective in helping to get us that sticky knowledge that we require to really provide informed and a coherent foreign policy approach.
Who can take on the first part of His Eminence's question? Yeah, Marian?
I'd like to comment on that, because I think when we classify countries as secular, we might want to break that down into the model of secularism that we see, say, in France, which is quite restrictive toward a public role for religion, and the models of secularism that we see in Canada and the United States, where at their very best, they are examples of societies where many religions coexist, have a part in public life, and not only coexist, but at their very best, flourish.
Yes. I know.
Just also to add a little element, for me the most interesting definition of secularity of the state came actually from South Asia. I was in Bangladesh recently. I visited also India, even though not officially, and their secularity of the state is pretty much understood, not necessarily implemented, as a space-providing principle. So in inclusive secularity,
Yes.
So it's not only that we have to sort this out within the West, because there we already have a number of very different understandings of doctrinal, restrictive, excessively restrictive, Kazakhstan, or other forms of secular, or Turkey, a very distorted, but I mean there are also discussions taking place in totally different parts of the world that we hardly know. And South Asia is, for me, the most fascinating example.
All right, yes.
Thank you. I'm Scott Moore from Baylor University in Waco, Texas. One of you mentioned at one point that fighting terrorism has become the be-all and end-all for how we address so many matters here. Currently, right now, a number of U.S. governors, I think the majority of U.S. governors, have announced that they will no longer allow any refugees coming from these war-torn nations in the Middle East. My own governor, for whom I voted, has taken it a step further, in which they are now actively prosecuting any agencies based in Texas who would assist with both the vetting and the resettlement of refugees who are trying to leave some of these war-torn areas. My own efforts to this point with members of our legislature have been a colossal failure. Do you have any advice for how we can work with our governments and our government agencies to address these basic humanitarian issues, which, as Professor Glendon, you pointed out, not only border on complicity, but are complicit with some of these agencies? Thank you.
Who wants to take on that question? You know, it's a profoundly important question, and in a way, I think it relates to the previous question about Christians in the Middle East, because there's also a poignant tension between wanting to welcome refugees on the one hand, and on the other hand, having policies that ensure these people are safe in their own societies. And I'm wondering if there are any thoughts about that, about, there's even debate about whether there should be a designation of genocide for what's happening to Christians in the Middle East, and there's some debate about whether it is or isn't. I'm just curious about if the panelists could address any of those questions.
Maybe just an element of an answer. There is a particular danger currently that we might go back to the policy of cuius regio, eius religio. We see it happening. The idea of, okay, we divide Sudan, fine. Nothing has become fine. Horrible. And the partition of South Asia, of course, I mean, everyone knows what a disaster that triggered. Now, when talking about the Middle East, strangely, these ideas re-emerge. I mean, because no one has a recipe. That's why we have to be innovative. But there's a certain danger that we really embark on a re-territorialization of religion and a re-religionization of territories. Also, when dealing with the refugee situation in Europe, we see both. I'm from Germany. In Germany, so far, surprisingly little discussions have taken place, fortunately, about where do these people come from? Are they Muslims or are they Christians? Surprisingly little. I mean, it's going to change, and it is already changing. In other parts of Europe also we see a tendency to say, okay, if we take refugees, then they should be from our broader family. And that really would be very, very dangerous. Very dangerous also when designing now some plans for Syria, for Iraq. Let's not embark on a re-territorialization of religion and vice versa, religionization of territories. I think that equation, my territory, my religion, has been very pernicious. It's very dangerous. I'm not sure, I mean, this is not the answer to the question, but maybe an element of an answer.
There's a question on this side. Go
Yes,
ahead,
thank you.
Michael.
Yes, Michael Murray from the John Templeton Foundation. First of all, let me just say I really appreciated all your comments, and I'm really glad that you're all here, and it's an honor to have an opportunity to just say a few words to you. At the John Templeton Foundation, there are a few other things that we think about with respect to religious liberty that I haven't heard you mention, and I wanted to just put those on the table and then get your reaction to these. So just 4 quick things. The first is, I really appreciated hearing Marianne's comments about coalition building amongst governments, amongst states, and that's a really important thing. But there also needs to be coalition building from people from different points on the ideological spectrum. So not just different religious traditions, but some of you have mentioned also secular humanist communities, libertarians, sort of right-wing atheist groups that are champions for religious liberty, but it's not self-interested. So it carries a different type of credibility with audiences than it does when it comes from Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and Hindus. So I'd be curious to hear what you think about that. The second is, or actually the next 2, just concern intellectual matters. So having a better secular justification for religious liberty. The arguments of Kant and Bale and Locke arguably don't work. And the question is, what's the secular argument in favor of this? If you're not committed to a religious tradition, why should you buy into this? What's its value? And I think many of the arguments are utilitarian in nature, and I think those who are advocates of religious oppression don't buy that. They think they just need to do it better. On the other side, it's religious justifications for religious liberty. So how can we, from within the religious traditions, justify the importance of religious liberty? And I think you see that in Catholic tradition. I think it's a more difficult matter in Islam. We heard some discussion about that yesterday. But providing resources for and funding for, and then bringing visibility to those who are making arguments from within their religious tradition for religious liberty for all. And then the last is, it seems to me that those who are most skeptical about religious liberty, part of the reason for that, at least, and I'm probably speaking mostly out of the American experience, is because they see that it's giving liberty to people who are doing bad things. And is there a place for making more visible and more salient the positive contributions that religious communities make to those communities in which they're embedded? And how does that fit into this broader picture?
Well, you've given us a lot to chew on, so I'll let the panelists, we may not be able to cover everything, Michael, but, okay, go ahead, Andy.
Just very quickly, on the first point, sort of the importance of the non-ideological, non-partisan aspect of this issue. I think it's very clear that many different groups need to come into this tent when we talk about religious freedom. And even though it's not specifically enumerated in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration that kind of provides this definition of of religious freedom. In our work, we've always said that if we're going to be consistent in arguing for religious freedom, we also have to argue for the right to not believe. That's consistent. And so we've reached out very actively to secular humanist groups, to atheists, and when we talk about human dignity, which is this, there's a leitmotif of this entire conference, it's human dignity. When you use that language, they get that language. They accept that language. So in terms of a secular justification for religious freedom, I think you can take part of the religious justification we've been using, and that is dignity, the dignity of a human being. Beyond the Article 18 sort of formal definition that you see in the Universal Declaration, what is religious freedom? I mean, religious freedom, I would argue, as I have in the past, is the freedom to contemplate, who am I? Who am I in relationship to you and to other people? Who am I in relationship to this world that I live in? And who am I in relationship to God, or if I don't have a theistic belief, who am I in relationship to the philosophy that I choose to ascribe to? That, I think, in a nutshell, is what religious freedom is. I mean, it's an existential necessity for human beings. And it's that existential reality that then links into all these other freedoms. If I can't get that right, if I don't have the freedom to think all these things, how can I possibly have freedom of expression or association and so forth? So I think there's, the religious justification, human dignity, the imago Dei that we've been speaking about, I think that's quite clear. The liberty for people doing bad things, I mean, one thing I think we have to always emphasize, as we have, is that all rights come with responsibilities.
Amen.
And if we use human dignity as our touchstone, then we can, I think, very safely argue from the perspective of religious freedom that when certain, Christian groups, and I use Christian in quotations, in Uganda and other parts of Africa that are preaching violent hatred towards people with the same-sex, orientation, and wanting to violently harm these people, well, that is not acceptable under religious freedom. That is a violation of that person's human dignity. It is perfectly justifiable under religious freedom for the Catholic Church, Orthodox churches, Orthodox Judaism, Islam, to have a certain understanding of human sexuality and human sexual ethics that might be different from what secular society is saying. And that needs to be protected. But when that becomes distorted or any other idea becomes distorted to target someone violently, well, that's not acceptable. So we have to have an understanding of religious freedom that it does link in with a certain responsibility.